All right, everybody. We're only 15 minutes late. Technical difficulties. Yeah, I like the woo in the back. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to BSides Knoxville, the first one ever. A couple of logistics. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. It's good to see all the security professionals in the region come together and talk with each other, maybe for the first time for some of you. A couple of logistics. I've been told there's a bartender here, so we made you get up in the morning. You have drink tickets. You can get drinks. Those drink tickets, you can use them throughout the day. Food, if you have not eaten, breakfast is over in Preservation Pub, and it will be lunch will be over there as well. We do have a few seats here open, so if you're out in the lobby, you can file in here. We have seating upstairs, and for the somebody helping you down here. And then for the keynote only, we're streaming in track 2 at the KEC. So this session right here is going live to both areas right now, barring any technical difficulties. And then track 2 throughout the day is going to be over there as well, so we'll split right after the keynote actually ends. So with that, I will not waste any more time. Our keynote today is someone who's been speaking at multiple security conferences. You may have seen his work in academic publications at places like Black Hat and DEF CON. He's done multiple research, packet and packet hacking, a few other things as well. But with that, we have the fortunate honor of having the good preacher Travis Goodspeed do our keynote today.
Howdy, y'all. You can sing along if you like. You're waiting for me to interrupt this, but I won't.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? My neighbor?
Howdy, neighbors.
Together again.
It was either that or Wu-Tang Clan, so... So I've been committing a sin lately, and as a preacher, I'm required to confess that in public, just like Jimmy Swaggart and the other televangelists. My sin is that I've been thought leading, and I've been doing keynotes, and I feel really bad about this, and I'm going to quit any day now. Because when you do a keynote, there's like a procedure you're supposed to do. You're supposed to begin with a Sun Tzu quote. Please, for the love of God, cut this shit out. Because like Sun Tzu is blah 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 for whatever if you're trying to manage supply lines for armies, but it really doesn't matter that much about technology. I don't think that I'm being rude to the man when I say that he was not a very good electrical engineer. He's also not very good at reverse engineering malware. So we should cut that shit out, because you want to do the art of assembly language and not the art of war, right? I have notes even, trying to be responsible. So what you should do instead of this wiki quote horseshit is you should teach each other nifty tricks, right? How many of you here have used Bitcoin? Okay, so how many of you here have, in the process of using Bitcoin or had it being evangelized to you, you wound up in the unenviable position of sitting there while one drunk says to another drunk, "You don't understand economics, man." Okay, the same people, right? So But there are nifty things that you can do with Bitcoin. Like, my buddy Dan Kaminsky and I were hanging out at the bar at Black Hat, and we were joking about the way that Bitcoin works. This was about the same time that Tavis Ormandy began to reverse engineer the antivirus software to come up with custom-generated false positives. So you can take the same rules that are in the antivirus software, and you can use it to just produce false positives from the rule set, and then you spew them everywhere, and you set off all of the alarm bells. So we were trying to find like a target that this could be used in maliciously. And we realized that in some protocols, there's no cryptography because there's no point to cryptography. Bitcoin is one of these protocols. So when you use Bitcoin, and I'm using Bitcoin, my laptop and your laptop and everybody else in the network, they're all sharing the packets with each other that describe the blockchain. And the blockchain is verified, but it's not encrypted. So it's going over the air in clear text. This isn't a problem as far as the integrity of the chain goes, because it being clear text doesn't allow you to change anything in the ledger, right? Because you would be no different than any other malicious participant in the network. What it does allow you to do is to publish things into the ledger. So what we did was we sent a bunch of the smallest fraction of a Bitcoin that you can send. We sent those to addresses that were fake. They are 20 bytes long, and they just happen to be ASCII text. So if you run strings-n20 on the very first file of the blockchain, you get ASCII art of Len Sassman, and a eulogy to him, and a description about his life. And just because Len would find this to be utterly fucking hilarious, we also included an ASCII art portrait of Ben Bernanke, the then chairman of the Federal Reserve. So every Bitcoin user on Earth has a picture of Ben Bernanke on his hard disk because of me. There are other nifty tricks you can do. You can play around with radio, right? So the idea behind shortwave radio, for those of you who are not familiar, and you should be familiar, because in Tennessee you can do awesome things with radio that are utterly impossible in Manhattan, where I have the misfortune of living. So the idea is that you have a giant antenna coming up above your house, and you run a radio signal into it with up to, say, 100 watts. Legally, you can do up to 1,500. And this signal bounces off of the atmosphere. So you can communicate with other continents. You can transmit from here to Argentina, and there are people in Argentina who have radios, and they'll talk back to you. And this happens because anything under about 50 megahertz sometimes reflects off of the atmosphere. So if you choose the right frequency and you transmit at the right time of day, your signal will go to other countries. So I'm playing around with my radio, and I start noticing interference. And wherever you have a problem in software or in hardware, that's usually an opportunity to be clever and malicious. In this case, I wound up with an interfering signal right in the middle of the 10-meter PSK31 band. This is where you use just a 30 baud radio signal in order to transmit text. And the text is designed at 30 baud because that's about how fast you type. So it's used for live conversations with modems. And I had this giant interfering signal in the middle of it. And again, I live in Manhattan, so I can't have an antenna locally, so I have to SSH into my antenna. With a VNC, so I'm burning like a megabyte every minute or so just to transmit at 30 baud. Not a very efficient use of bandwidth. But I noticed that whenever I jumped away from the screen, the interference would drop down a lot. And whenever I jumped back to that screen, it would jump back up. Like in the waterfall diagram, I saw it expanding and contracting. So I called a friend of mine who lives down the street from my antenna, and I said, "Hey, Jim, do you see the signal at 28.121 megahertz?" And he fiddles around with his radio, and he's like, "Yeah, I hear a whistle." And I said, "Okay, listen to that whistle and tell me if it changes." And then I jumped onto the VNC session, and he said, "Yeah, it got all staticky, like a little bit of popping sound." So last weekend, we managed to transmit Morse code from this interference. Now, the interference it turns out, you know the twisted pairs in 100 megabit Ethernet? Have you ever been lazy and untwisted them just too much? And you plug it into the connector and it works anyways, so you just high five and you're done wiring the house? Maybe y'all are more responsible than I am. So that's what the interference was coming from. And wherever you see this wide pattern here, that's when traffic is going over my home network. And whenever you see this thin line here, with maybe like a little blip when there's some small traffic, that's when almost nothing is going over my home network. With a shortwave radio, you can tell when I am streaming a movie to my laptop. With a shortwave radio, you can receive data exfiltrated from my home network even if I cut it off from the internet. Isn't that nifty? So you should share these tricks with each other, right? Because these tricks are how you do new things in engineering. And they're how you find new bugs to exploit. They're how you understand the things that you're reverse engineering. And in addition to sharing these tricks, you should read the fucking paper. I'm serious about this. And you should treat it like scripture. Frac 4914 is smashing the stack for fun and profit. This is where many of us learned how the call stack works in C for the very first time. This is how we learned how to overwrite a return pointer in order to get code execution of foreign code. There's uninformed 6.2. This is a lovely one. This is when a couple of neighbors got together and they started fuzzing Wi-Fi drivers from the radio side. And Wi-Fi has a lot of fields that are always a specific value, a known value. And it has sizes that have to line up to each other. So they found that they could actually get a stack buffer overflow with memory corruption exploitably in the Windows kernel and the Mac kernel and the Linux kernel through a Wi-Fi beacon. Isn't that nifty? But treat it as scripture, right? And these books from No Starch, right? This Hacking, The Art of Exploitation, Metasploit, The Pen Tester's Guide. Okay, these books won't exist if we don't read them. Bill Pollock is a saint for publishing this stuff. The Hacking the Xbox book. Bunny's publisher wimped out on him, refused to take the legal risk. So No Starch printed it. And they keep doing this. They keep coming out with books that teach us how to do reverse engineering, how to do hacking, how to read, how to write. You know? So you should also write the fucking paper. These books won't exist if we don't write them. And these articles won't exist if we don't write them. And if you write them, you can get them published. And then people look at them and they think you're a lot smarter than you actually are. It's lovely. Then you can stop writing papers and start thought leading and you just rant on stage for a half hour. It's great. And also being a preacher, people come up to me and they try to gossip with me, right? I mean, in some faiths you confess to your priest directly. In others you gossip directly with God. You know, like, you remember the one where Homer found the power of prayer? And he just kept gossiping about Maud Flanders? So people come up to me and they say, oh, the so-and-so group is unethical, right? So the black hats, they come up to me and they say that the white hats are unethical. They say that the white hats kill bugs and that we should cherish bugs like good Buddhists. And we should turn them into memory corruption exploits, and then we should make them self-propagating, and we should release them into the world to spread and to do all sorts of clever things. You know, but I explained to them that if the white hats didn't kill bugs, there would be no selective pressure to come up with more clever bugs or more clever exploits. So don't be too hard on the white hats. And then people get hard on the black hats. You know, you have Chris Sagoyan, and he gets up and he calls them merchants of death. Lords of war, you know, all because they're playing around with little numbers. They're writing little software. And, you know, so I asked, why? What's so unethical about this? And after the hyperbole in which they were accused of being responsible for the ills of the youth and the corruption in society, it comes down to them not publishing their results. black hats know all sorts of incredible things that they don't really share. The biblical term for it is when you have a candle that's covered by a basket, right? It says that you shouldn't cover the candle with a basket because that doesn't allow the light to shine. But have you ever tried covering a candle with a basket? What actually happens is that the candle lights the basket on fire and it burns 10 times as bright. And is not self-replicating malware just a white paper written for reverse engineers to read? And you can do this. You can take apart malware, you can take apart an exploit or a packet capture, and you can learn the tricks that were used to exploit your system. You can learn the tricks that are being used against you, even if they're not being published. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. That would have been a good intro music. Another nifty trick you can do any of you remember these things? Right? So what is this? Okay, so everyone who said that iPod is wrong. This is a cigarette case. The iPod, though, it's a really cool device, especially when this first came out. Like, do any of you remember how exciting it was when Linux was first booted on this thing? I mean, this was a computer you could fit in your pocket. And that was back when cell phones had numbers on them and buttons and all sorts of crazy advanced technology. During the Zoolander era, do you remember how small they made phones back then? But this iPod, this is a full-fledged computer. You can program this in C. So some neighborly folks got together and they reverse engineered the iPod firmware, and they ported an operating system called Rockbox. Rockbox is an open source MP3 player. So you take your iPod that you went to all the trouble in the world to get with the Apple tax and everything, and you plug it up to your computer, and you put open source software on it, and suddenly its battery life gets cut in half, and the sound quality goes to hell, and every now and then it just crashes and reboots on you. So it's kind of like Linux for your iPod. The cool thing about this, though, is that they had to re-implement all of the iPod features from scratch. So this plays music. This allows you to record music. You can play Doom on your iPod. One of the other things that an iPod has to do is it has to allow music to come in from your host. In today's highfalutin world, your iPhone speaks a custom protocol that's really complicated, and you have to use iTunes to put music on it. Back then, the iPod was the same way, but the iPod also had a disk that you could access. You could mount it on your computer, and you could copy files onto it. You could not, however, play music files from the file system with your iPod in the original style. So in Rockbox, they just added that. So in Rockbox, if you want to play an MP3, you just navigate to the directory, and you tell it to play the directory. To do this, they had to implement USB mass storage. So when you have a thumb drive, or you have a serial ATA disk, or you have anything like that, you think of it as a block device. And you think of that block device as having a file system on top of it. And these layers of abstraction are how you're taught to deal with technology. But a disk is actually a lot more like a server, in that the host sends requests to it, and the device sends the data back, or writes the data to its disk. So I wrote this little patch for the Rockbox firmware. And what this patch does, you can get it from palcogtfo 00.pdf. This patch hooks all of the requests for blocks from the disk. So when you request block number blah, 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 it compares it. And if the sector that you request is greater than 10,000 and less than 48,000, it knows that you are reading an unallocated region of the disk. This is not part of any file system. Your host has no legitimate reason to read this. But this is what happens in every forensics lab, because the very first thing that you do in a forensics lab is you read the disk from the beginning to the end, and then you stop, just like Alice telling her story. So if it sees you doing that, it just marks that the tamper has been detected. And then down here, if the tamper has been detected, every even sector returns never going to give you up, and every odd sector returns never going to let you down. So the poor forensics guy winds up with an image of 80 gigabytes of Rick Astley lyrics, which are exactly as legitimate as the quality control standards that have been used in every one of his other court cases. You can go further than that. When I was at Eurocom in the south of France, by the by, the French do have good food, but they have the worst fast food in the world. The idea here is that you can actually reprogram a serial ATA disk in the same way that you can reprogram your iPod. We managed to do this for a Seagate Barracuda 1 terabyte disk. In our patched firmware, whenever a sector is being written, the disk looks for a quick little tag that tells it that the thing being written is a command and not actual data. But it's going through the normal data channel. So anywhere that I can save something to your hard disk and read it back, I can then talk through a back channel to a backdoor that's running in the disk's firmware. In this particular example, there's a stupid social media Web 2.0 website. It could be WordPress. WordPress is a remote administration toolkit that has a blog as an extra feature. But we didn't exploit any WordPress vulnerabilities. We're assuming that this WordPress is good, if such a thing will ever happen in the future. So the remote attacker uses HTTP to connect to the web server. The web server is running the WordPress, and it uses MySQL to connect to a database server. And the database server uses MySQL to talk through the MySQL storage engine down to the file system driver, say ext4. The file system driver uses the block.io device driver to write to the disk. And the disk is where our backdoor sits. So the remote attacker connects to the website, and he says, I would like to update my profile. I would like my profile to be this piece of base64 encoded blobbery. And the web server allows that. And then the new profile goes out to the SQL database server, which gets written onto the hard disk. And the hard disk decodes this and sees that the remote attacker wants a copy of etc shadow. So it then uses its file system driver to run along, find etc shadow, and save that to the location instead of the command that it was given. So then the remote attacker says, oh wait, I forgot what my profile is. Could you please send that back to me? And the web server asks the database server, which asks the block device. And the block device gives him back his profile, which now is the contents of etc shadow. You can actually mount the entire hard disk remotely this way. And this causes less than a 1% performance hit. So it looks like the disk is just naturally aging. Isn't that nifty? The other thing about being a preacher is that people ask you for advice, and the students in particular, they want to know which programming language to use. And they don't understand how boring it can be to constantly get this question. So I'm drinking my scotch, and the student comes up to me and he says, well, which programming language should I use? And I said, there is divinity in every programming language that has ever been made. Every last one of them. And he says, horse shit. You're joking with me. And I said, try and find a counterexample. And he says, well, what about PHP? And so I take a drink, and then I say, well, PHP is terrible for writing software. God help you if you have to build something complex and secure with it. But it's excellent for learning how to break software. How many of you learned SQL by writing a SQL injection exploit against poorly written PHP code? Raising your hand or not is not admissible in court. This is a confession. So that's the value of PHP. Not that it teaches you how to do something right, but that it teaches you how to do something wrong. And by seeing that train wreck of technical debt, you know not to reproduce that in the things that you're building yourself. So the student comes back to me and he says, well, what about BASIC? Edsger Dijkstra says that GoTo is harmful and that BASIC corrupts the minds of the youth. And I said, well, Edsger Dijkstra is racist. He's racist against BASIC because BASIC is the greatest introductory programming language. If any of you have children and you're trying to teach them how to program, and for some idiotic reason you want them to grow up to be reverse engineers, give them BASIC. And I'll tell you why. BASIC has two features that nothing else on earth can compare to. The first feature is that line-numbered BASIC becomes so complicated that you have to learn to understand spaghetti code. You have to learn how to chase through these different line numbers. For those of you who are too young to have used BASIC, in BASIC you count your lines by tens. So the traditional first program is 10, print hello world, 20, go to 10. The reason why you do it by tens is so that you can add a 15 in the middle to do something else. And this creates hideous code. It's horrible to read. But when you've learned how to program by looking at that sort of spaghetti code, and then you start trying to reverse engineer assembly language that's produced by a halfway competent compiler, it looks like a piece of cake. You know, no compiler can produce code as bad as a beginning BASIC programmer. If you try to reverse engineer gorillas.bas, then by the time you start reverse engineering malware in IDA Pro, you'll think, oh, this is a piece of cake. There's another reason. So like every programming book begins with hello world, and then it teaches you loops, it teaches you variables, it teaches you some other things about the language, but none of them are as cool as about the 6th chapter of every book on line-numbered BASIC. This is from a book on programming the Apple II. And I'm going to read this aloud just so you can imagine how absurd this is from a modern standpoint. As you have seen, peak of negative 16,336 clicks the speakers of the Apple II. Poke, negative 16,336, 0, will also click the speaker, and any program which repeatedly peaks or pokes the address, negative 16,336, will produce a steady tone. So peak reads a value from memory, poke writes a value into memory at an arbitrary address. So what this is telling children to stick their finger into the brain of the Apple II just to watch the thing twitch because that'll make some noise. Is this not the greatest educational tool you've ever seen? Because from this you learn strobe registers. Notice that you don't just have to write to that address to cause an effect. Actually, reading from that address will cause an effect. And the reason from that is that in the Apple II's wiring, they just run the address lines off to select the sound device. They don't bother running the data lines anywhere near that chip because that would involve extra wiring. They're trying to save copper and they're trying to save transistors. This also teaches you that the computer itself has memory addresses. This is a pointer. It teaches you that the memory address space is a signed integer, right? Because Apple BASIC doesn't support unsigned addresses. So this is actually in the upper half of memory, but you give it a negative address because that's the only way to have the right value. Because you can read from an arbitrary address, you can use the peek command to dump a copy of the Apple II ROM to the screen or to the printer. You can disassemble that ROM. All of this you learn from a 6th chapter of a children's book trying to tell you how to make a sound on the speaker. This is the learning curve of a cardboard box. It's brilliant. So then the student says, well, I've got another example, preacher. And I said, no, there's no example that can stump me. And he says, well, what about Java? And I take a shot of whiskey. It was good whiskey. It was sipping whiskey. I feel bad for it, but I just shot it down and I said, the lesson is over for today. There are other things that you can do when you're not able to use the technology that you have. So, I mean, quite a few of us work defending computers. And we have all of these nifty techniques that we've learned for breaking into computers. But we don't want to do anything unethical, so sometimes we have fewer opportunities. This is a car from the Soviet Union. This has a motorcycle engine in it. It's a copy of the American King Midget. My dad had a King Midget. He told me that marriage is when you could no longer park your car in the living room. And these things were lovely. They had a motorcycle engine. They had a belt-driven replacement for the transmission. You get 90 miles per gallon. It says 45 miles per hour, but I can't imagine it actually going that fast. This poor little fellow, he's in the Soviet Union. He has his little car. Now, the King Midget was like a toy car or a kit car. You'd have to assemble it yourself from pieces that would come mail order. But this car, even though it was just as ridiculous and just as underpowered a vehicle, this was a status symbol. You know, you had to have connections to get this. So our poor fellow, we'll call him Dmitry. Dmitry is sitting there, and he has this fancy car, and he wants to drive it around, and doesn't want it to get stolen. And he also likes amateur radio, but he's not allowed to transmit because he's in one of those like closed Soviet villages that were used for designing missiles and stuff. And if any shortwave signal started coming out of there, well, the black helicopters would swoop in. So what he did was he built a shortwave transmitter, and he put it into his car with a cutoff switch so that he knew to turn the cutoff switch off before turning the car on so that the radio wouldn't transmit. But if he didn't know this, then the car would start chirping out what sounded almost like encrypted Morse code on a shortwave channel. So the teenagers who stole his car never expected to get pulled over by black helicopters. The other thing that we sometimes get caught up in is we get caught up in having specific tools. We're told that you should use Metasploit in order to quickly demonstrate popular vulnerability. We're told that you should use IDA-Pro to reverse engineer executables, and that you should use hexbrays to decompile them. But when you're broke, you do something lovely, which is that you build your own tools. I learned the MSP430 architecture by building a quick little reverse engineering tool for it. I called it MSP430 Static. And it was not nearly as feature-rich as IDA-Pro. And the only reason I did this was because the pirated editions of IDA-Pro back then didn't support the MSP430. So there was this guy named Noah. And Noah wanted to build a boat. And so he starts gathering wood one day, and his friends tell him to just buy a fucking boat. He could get a nice little speedboat. He could go around with the giraffes. You know, he could have all sorts of fun. And he said, nope, I'm just building my own bird feeder. And then there was this guy named Howard Hughes. You might remember him from such lovely press incidents when he caught syphilis from Katharine Hepburn. He bought the Las Vegas Strip from the mob. He was an eccentric billionaire. He inherited a tool company, spent all of the money of his inheritance building an air force, his own private air force, to shoot a movie about World War I dogfighting. He also had engineers in order to maintain these planes, and he started racing planes by building faster ones. So poor Howard Hughes, just as he was running down on his luck, just about to go broke, this thing called World War II broke out, and President Roosevelt needed an air force. So he bought Howie's. Howard Hughes then kept his engineering task force, and that's what's now Hughes Aerospace. They launch satellites into orbit. So the CIA went to Howard Hughes in the late 60s or the early 70s, and they said, Howie, we've got a problem. We need your help. There is a Soviet submarine that has crashed off the coast of Hawaii, and we want to steal it. And Howie said, sure, I'll help. This will be cool. We'll build a giant boat, we'll have a giant crane, we'll just sail out there, we'll pick it up off the ocean floor, drop it on the deck, and we are good. And they said, yeah, but you got to keep this really quiet, Howie. You got to keep it hush-hush. So the very next day, Howard Hughes had a press release, a press conference, invited everybody out. He's like, hey guys, I'm building a giant boat. Because there are giant globs of copper on the Pacific Ocean floor, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to pick them up off the floor, drop the globs of copper on the deck, and put every copper mining company in the world out of business. He had, of course, been short selling the stock, so he used the profits from the stock swindle to fund the boat. And this boat went out and it picked the submarine up off the ocean floor and dropped it on the deck. And that only happened because Howard Hughes built his own fucking bird feeder. And you should do the same. You should also share stories with each other. You should share techniques with each other. You should share books with each other. You should read the fucking paper, and you should write the fucking paper. If everybody would please stand. All right, now please be seated. So I'm going to finish up now, and we're going to prepare for the next talk, which is a collection of nifty tricks on toys, on like little puzzles and such. And while we're waiting for the next speaker to connect his laptop, hopefully fewer technical difficulties than I've experienced. But while we're waiting for that, I want you to talk to each other, and I want you to share nifty tricks with each other. And when you're doing that, I want you to focus on how the trick worked and what clever thing you learned from it rather than the effect. Because the target of a hack doesn't matter the day after the bug is patched. What matters is how you use it to write the next one, how you use it to come up with the next nifty trick, or the next project, the next clever thing. So thank you kindly, and please go in peace. Oh, and I'll be giving away a book, but you have to teach me something clever if you want it.
All right, so everybody, before everybody leaves, because we're still streaming to both sides,